All right, I think we can get started. Welcome everyone to this LeidenAsiaCentre webinar on China and green energy. I'm very pleased to have three distinguished speakers joining us today for this session. A bit of housekeeping before we get started. I should point out to you, if the pop-up didn't already inform you, that the session is recorded. We are doing that so that we can also later put the conversations, the presentations that we had here online, but we are not going to include the Q&A. So you don't have to worry about what you want to ask or what you want to say. Then we're going to include only the presentations, which will be about 8 minutes per person, and then we move into our question and answer session. So let me get started by first pointing out that we have been at the LeidenAsiaCentre looking into questions of changing green energy markets and politics for some time. And it's also, in a way, a project that is attached to our interest in the Belt and Road Initiative and how infrastructures and connectivities have been changing in Asia and in elsewhere, with often China at the forefront of many of these changes. And so in that sense, we are extending today that interest by focusing specifically on green energy. And I would like to welcome our three speakers in order of appearance. We have Dr. Forough, who is a former research fellow from the LeidenAsiaCentre and has now joined the GIGA in Hamburg, the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, where he's part of the project World Order Narratives of the Global South. And he will be discussing China's role in the renewable energy sector, specifically in the Middle East and North Africa. After that, we hear from Dr. Handke. Susann Handke has concluded her PhD research at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, just around the corner from Leiden. And her doctoral research was on how the UN climate regime interacts with national energy legislation. And she will be discussing today with us the geopolitical impact of Chinese electric companies abroad. And then to conclude, we have David Harmon joining us. He is the EU Cybersecurity and Public Affairs Director of the company Huawei. He was formerly based in Shenzhen, where he was responsible for the company's global relations, and now he is in Brussels with a stronger EU focus. And he will be discussing the role of PRC tech companies more broadly in the transition to renewable energy, and of course, focusing specifically on Huawei. So with no further ado, let me hand over to Mohammed for our first talk.
Thanks, Florian, for the kind introduction. I'm trying to share my screen here, so let me know when. First of all, I would like to thank LeidenAsiaCentre for the invitation, and also thank you for sponsoring the report based on which this presentation has been prepared. The report basically from last year, which addresses the expanding influence of China's green energy in the Middle East region. So without further ado, I would basically get into the topic. Generally, as basically introduction for this topic, we should first talk about China's two phases. This is the first phase with which most of us are familiar, the basically vast scale of pollution in China. And this is like a typical picture that you would see here and there. This is another phase with which basically the opposite phase with which most people are getting increasingly familiar, at least the specialists, analysts, and academics. That is to say, China's successes and achievements against environmental pollution and in the renewable energy sector. This is an example of the second phase of China, basically the successes that it has had, renewable capacity growth by country/region. You can see that China by far surpasses other countries or regions, including the whole continent or the whole European Union. In these years, because we don't have too much time, I will not get into too many details. This was published a couple of days ago from International Renewable Energy Agency and also International Energy Agency. 2 days ago, it was published that China built more offshore wind capacity in 2021 than the rest of the world had managed to build in from 2016 to 2020 combined. So this is another piece of evidence for the second phase that China is presenting itself. This is a snapshot of the report that LeidenAsiaCentre produced last year that I worked on. You can see some examples of, again, successes that China has in relation to the second phase that I talked about. It's the biggest investor in renewable capacity in the past decade, the world's largest producer of wind power, for which I showed you in the last on the last slide, the wind power capacity from 2021. It's the biggest in solar power, biggest in hydroelectric power, the largest market for electric vehicles in 2015 when it overtook the US. China boasted 5 of the world's 6 largest solar module manufacturing companies and the world's largest wind turbine manufacturer. These are some of the achievements that China has had in this area. They also have had corresponding discourses, if you want to call them propaganda. Feel free to do that depending on your perspective, such as ecological civilization that they are using in their basically policy agendas and policy discourses. Globally, they have developed global energy interconnection. In terms of funding, they have developed first the Silk Road Fund and then a new fund called Green Silk Road Fund, which has invested a lot around the world, including in the Middle East. As you all know, as people familiar with China's system know, there's more alignment and coordination between the public and private sector, as opposed to a country like the US, where the private sector does one thing and the public another thing. Because of lack of time, I will not get into the details of the European deal. The EU is acting a little bit more in more of a concerted fashion than the US, such as the European Green Deal, the EU climate law, which some people criticize because it was a little bit watered down. The EU betting on green hydrogen is also discussed in the report. So these developments have led some politicians, including on the left side, an article in New York Times by John Kerry, who, as you know, is currently the American envoy for climate, and Ro Khanna, the Democratic representative in the US, basically urging American politicians and businesses not to let China be the winner of the green race. Some people are arguing already that China is winning the clean energy race. So it's important to remember these things because, as you know, these days we're all in the midst of basically news about Ukraine, about Russia, about the US versus Russia. But these developments are happening in the world, whether we like it or not, whether we focus on whether we focus on Russian-American relations or not. These things are happening. And I think it's a good thing that LeidenAsiaCentre is organizing these things these days, especially. China-Middle East relations are deepening. I will not again get into the details too much. It's in the report. The so-called non-intervention policy, which I argue in the 2019 article is some sort of intervention with Chinese characteristics, is part of the appeal of China, but also perhaps most importantly is basically the green energy achievements of China. In terms of the general body of relations between the Middle East and China, you can see it's one of the regions in which China has been most warmly received. As an example of that, in the last 20 days, the foreign ministers of basically 10 important geopolitically, geoeconomically important countries in the region, basically all of them minus Israel, went to China to coordinate their different issues with China. So you can see that China is becoming increasingly the most significant partner in many fields for the region. Environmentally, the region, the Mediterranean region, which includes basically North Africa and the Middle East, according to NASA, it has been experiencing its worst environmental crisis in the last 900 years. So basically green energy relations between China and the MENA region is a match made in heaven, if you want to say that, or a match made in environmental hell, which the two sides found themselves in. There are examples of regional cooperation that I discussed basically in the report. Some of the most important ones I will just briefly show you is between KSA stands for Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. They have a vision for their post-hydrocarbon future in which basically, or the discourse for which promotes relations with China, especially also in the field that we're discussing, the field of green energy, aqua power. A Saudi company, originally 100% Saudi company, now it's 49% owned by China Silk Road Fund. And it has become a platform for regional cooperation, regional investment, not only in this region, but also in Africa. They are investing. So Sino-Saudi relations, very, very important. UAE, another very important partner in the region for China that I discuss at some length in the report. They have the energy strategy to 2050. International Renewable Energy Agency is in UAE, in Abu Dhabi, which is very important. It will, as we go ahead, basically in time, as we move forward, this agency will become increasingly important in the world. And the fact that it is in the UAE, it's very significant. The UAE has also built one of the few basically fully green cities in the world, Master City, with a technical university only dedicated up to the PhD level to producing students and experts in green energy. That's the only university exclusively dedicated to this topic in the world. They have a lot of basically cooperation, which I discuss in detail in the report, a lot of cooperation with China. They also have the so-called clean coal. I don't think there's anything cold or anything really clean about coal, but they call it that. So I mentioned that in the report. And also the Sovereign Wealth Fund of UAE basically co-invests with China in the region and beyond. Then we discussed the Iran. I will not get into these anymore, just showing you that the report basically talks about Sino-Iranian relations in the green energy sector. I will leave these now. I will not talk about them because we don't have time. If you want, during Q&A, we can discuss the Sino-Iranian relations, Sino-Turkish relations, or Chinese activities in the green sector of North Africa. This is basically this quote from the chief of the master city, the basically green energy city of UAE, summarizes the conclusion of the report when it comes to the Middle Eastern attitude towards this topic, the rise of China. He argues that if you're in the business of renewable energy, you basically have to look to China. You cannot ignore China. So there's the increasingly common perspective in the region that China is basically a green energy superpower, or at least global power. These are some of the challenges that I also discussed, and not everything is rosy about China and its activities. This is my last slide. I will go through them very quickly. Regional actors perceive China. This is the perception, but then you have the environmental crisis, which is becoming a multiplier of other crises in the region. You have poor water management in the region, lack of political will to go green in the region. You have corruption at different levels in these countries. You have lack of a well-functioning regional organization in this region. You have the unilateral sanctions from the US, for instance, which hampers Sino-Iranian or Sino-Syrian cooperation. Public attitude towards China is very negative in some cases, such as the Iranian public attitude is very negative, despite the fact that the elite are positive about that. And recently there was an attack, for instance, in Iraq on Sinopec guards. They were Senegalese guards, but it's a Chinese company. So the fact that an armed attack on it happened, COVID-19 and many other basically factors are challenges. We also discuss in the report the policy recommendations for the EU and the Netherlands, which if you want, we can discuss during the Q&A. So I'll stop here. Sorry if I went over time a little bit, but yeah. Thank you again for the invitation, and I hope you got something out of this presentation.
Thank you, Mohammed. Yeah, thank you for this insightful talk. we'll move straight on to our second speaker, Dr. Handke, who will be introducing us to State Grid and everything that is attached to Chinese energy companies. So please do go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Could you please put my presentation on the screen, Emma? Okay, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to present my research. I will discuss challenges that arise for the EU from China's approach to the low-carbon energy transition. This specifically concerns the Belt and Road Initiative as an international policy scheme of the Chinese leadership and activities of state-owned companies. The focus of my contribution is on the transmission of electricity, that is, the transport of electricity from generation sites to distribution stations. With the deployment of renewable energy sources such as wind and solar power, the transmission of electricity expands over ever longer distances, as renewable energy generation does not necessarily take place close to centers of electricity demand. So power transmission is a crucial component of the process of greening the energy sector. In the EU, the rules that apply to the transmission of electricity are proposed by the European Commission and adopted in a legislative procedure by the European Parliament and national governments. EU member states have been required to harmonize their energy legislation since the beginning of energy market integration in the late 1990s. And the book cover refers to this trend. In this book, my book chapter on Chinese involvement in the EU energy sector is included, on which I base my remarks today. The latest legislative initiative and package that now applies to the electricity sector in the European Union is the Clean Energy for All Europeans legislative package, which was adopted in 2019. And the climate law that was just mentioned also is included or builds on this package. This framework that has been established by this package helps EU policymakers and the energy sector to think about the Union's energy future and offers guidance on the way forward. The legislation also prescribes how to monitor the implementation of EU energy law. Initially, of course, the EU energy transition was supposed to be an internal matter. However, with the commencement of China's Belt and Road Initiative, it became clear that its realization also concerns the question of how to deal with external influences. Next slide, please. A surprising development from the perspective of the EU policymaking was the commencement of the Belt and Road Initiative that includes an energy component. And this proposal of a global energy grid is mainly promoted by State Grid and its former and current managers. The idea of a Chinese-driven global electricity network is to utilize wind energy generated in Arctic regions in the Northern Hemisphere and solar power produced in equatorial regions. These forms of renewable energy will then be fed into a global grid and transported to industrial and population centers across the globe, relying on ultra-high voltage transmission lines. And this is a technology that State Grid, the Chinese state-owned company, has first developed in China itself and was mainly promoted by its former chairman, Liu Zhenya. And he promotes the idea of the global grid tirelessly. He has written books about it and was also instrumental in establishing the Global Energy Interconnection Cooperation Organization, which he currently chairs. The organization is based in Beijing and has also an office in Berlin. He and other former and current State Grid managers promote the global grid and the company's ultra-high voltage technology to their through their participation in international business association and standard setting bodies, such as the International Electrotechnical Commission, and also have cooperation agreements and partnership agreements with the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and partner in sustainability affairs with the United Nations. The idea of a global grid was a topic on the agenda of the second Belt and Road Forum that was held in Beijing in 2019. So this idea is still evolving and further debated. And together with Chinese companies' engagement in international standard setting in the energy sector, it is a project that should be taken seriously. EU policymakers and people involved in the energy transition need to follow its evolution closely in order to formulate an informed response. Next slide, please. The challenge that State Grid's proposal of building a global grid poses to EU energy governance is twofold. It consists of an external and an internal aspect. The external challenge covers three issues: infrastructure, a dominant technology, and energy security considerations. For the EU, the most relevant transmission link of the proposed global grid would be the transmission line between Xinjiang and the EU. This link is part of the new Eurasian land bridge of the Belt and Road Initiative. Obviously, this link would add a wholly new external element to the EU infrastructure plans. Given the global scope of the Chinese-driven global grid, the link to the EU will probably not be governed by EU law. So the question is, which rules will apply? The governance of large infrastructure projects matters. Infrastructure remains in place for decades. Decisions on how to govern transnational infrastructure projects have profound long-term consequences for the regulation of economic sectors that rely on such projects. An example is the gas trade that was established between Western European countries and the Soviet Union in the late 1970s. Governance issues related to the supply infrastructure are haunting us and the entire continent to this day. The China-EU transmission link will at least in part utilize State Grid's ultra-high voltage technology. This would alter infrastructure plans that the European Commission elaborates and affect the competitiveness of European companies, which then face a state-owned enterprise as a competitor in their home market. This can be considered as a systemic challenge. Moreover, the project touches upon energy security matters for the EU. Supply of electricity through this China-EU transmission line would be dependent on Chinese technology, Chinese energy policy making, and governed by yet to determine international rules. Furthermore, energy security related to this transmission line would depend on the situation of every transition state, that is Kazakhstan, Russia, and either Belarus or Ukraine. There are stability concerns regarding the domestic situation in these countries, the country's relation with Russia, or the relationship between Russia and the EU itself. The internal aspect of the challenge that the global grid poses to the EU relates to the presence of Chinese transmission companies in the EU. Chinese state-owned electricity companies hold shares of companies in several EU member states. Furthermore, Chinese companies such as Pingao, a subsidiary of State Grid, offer construction and maintenance service in EU member states. Increasing reliance on Chinese state-owned companies and their pursuit of standard setting in the electricity sector would disadvantage European companies. The use of Chinese-built components comes with considerable supply chain risk that are currently felt across many economic sectors. Through their presence and at least indirect participation in the debate among European businesses, Chinese electricity companies are able to disseminate their vision for Europe's energy future. In order to find an informed response to the global grid in the EU context, more academic research is needed to assess various aspects of the China-EU transmission link. Final sentences. In 2017, a study was conducted for the European Commission that only focused on the technical viability of the project. It considered the link as feasible, but did not include any political and geo-economic factors. So a broader public debate among stakeholders is necessary. Finally, vigilant regulatory oversight should be brought into service in order to scrutinize the actions by Chinese state-owned companies in the Union and assess further attempts to take over energy companies in the EU. If used wisely, the Clean Energy for All Europeans legislative package and the investment screening regulation provide a set of tools that can be deployed to ensure that the Union's energy future is determined by EU citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susann. Let us move to our final speaker. As many of you know who have followed our LeidenAsiaCentre activities, we always try to make sure that we create a space for discussion between, on the one hand, scholars, and on the other hand, also practitioners. So we're particularly happy to have David Harmon joining us from Huawei, and I'm going to just directly hand over to you, David.
Florian, thanks very much indeed. Actually, I'd like to just take up on what Susan was just referencing in relation to issues connected to some Chinese companies working in a European Union context, because it's very fair to say that there's quite a lot of cooperation at a policy level between the European Union and China covering energy issues. I myself, between the years 2010 and 2014, I was one of the 6 members in the Cabinet of the European Commissioner for Research, Innovation and Science. And actually during that period, the EU signed an innovation dialogue with China. And through Europe's research and science instruments, there's quite a lot of cooperation between Chinese and European researchers, universities, and private sector companies in the context of Europe's research, science and innovation instruments, like the Horizon 2020 program that ran between 2014 and 2020, and also the new Horizon Europe program that runs between 2021 and 2027 is built on the principles of openness and the need for strong international collaboration. So there's already very strong structures in place in the policy domain of research and science, which is so fundamentally important to this discussion, because so many products, so many innovative products and services that emanate and come into the marketplace are there on the back of strong basic scientific research effort. So there's quite a lot of engagement between the EU and Chinese public, private, educational researchers and businesses, covering a whole host of sectors, whether in the field of smart cities, whether in the field of ICT activity, whether in the field of agriculture, and the broader sustainability debate. There is very strong engagement between EU and China in the area of sustainability. I mean, the Vice President of the European Commission, Franz Timmermans, is in quite regular contact with Vice Premier of China, Hans Jiang, in relation to striking broader agreement between the EU and China on how to address a whole range of issues covering sustainability, issues connected to biodiversity, issues connected to deforestation, issues connected to carbon reduction matters. I mean, the reality is, in the context of the UN Sustainability Goals, whether it's relating to UN Goal 15 that's connected to climate action, in the context of UN Sustainability Goals, or UN Goal 9 connected to the roles of industry, infrastructure and innovation in delivering the UN Sustainability Goals, these goals can only be delivered if the public and the private sectors bring in the necessary changes to effectuate those goals. It's not only the remit or responsibility for governments alone. That said, of course, governments need to keep the UN sustainability targets at the highest level of the political debate, so that best practices globally can be supported. And I do, in the context of the work I see in Huawei, and I've been in the company now over 7 years, I mean, our company, similar to many companies across the world, you build your products and services based on international collaboration, because you need the best people, best researchers and scientists to work together to ensure that the products and services that reach the marketplace are clean and green, and play our part in delivering upon the policy goals in the context of the European Union, whether it's the Fit for 55 policies, the EU Action Plan on the circular economy, and the broader EU Green Deal agenda. The bottom line is, like, we all have a role to play. Everyone has a role to play. All the people have a role to play. Private industry has a role to play. Universities have a role to play. Research institutes have a role to play. So certainly in the context of Huawei, our research focus is heavily built on ensuring that the products we deliver are energy efficient, because the telecommunications sector broadly does contribute in or around 2% of global emissions. So this is a sector that requires strong investment in research and science, particularly at a time when more and more data, more and more information is flowing over these telecom networks. And Huawei ourselves do build highly energy efficient data centers, and actually the products that we roll out in the context of building base stations are also premised on ensuring that these base stations are more energy efficient than before. And then in the broadest context, we would have very strong recycling facilities and green packaging operations. But the majority of companies, of course, are heading in this way, and rightly so, because we all know that the pressure on natural resources is very high. I mean, in 1950, the global population was 3 billion. It's now 7.5. Add another 50 years towards the end of the century, population is closer to 11.5 billion people. So this is necessary. It's compulsory, so to speak, that the targets connected to the UN Sustainability Goals are fully implemented. And I do feel myself that the discussions in Glasgow, COP26, I thought those discussions were like really intensive. Look, it struck me as that it struck a strong platform to further accelerate the debate on how to deliver on the UN Sustainability Goals. And of course, the European Union is centre stage in that. China centre stage in that, and countries across the length and breadth of the world have to play their role in the context of delivering this. I know I mentioned this at the start of my comments, but I would like to reiterate it. International collaboration is very important in all of these matters. It's actually, of course, governments set their own individual policies, but actually in the development of products, international collaboration is key. I mean, if you look at international studies from the World Bank or International Monetary Fund, the European Commission, the OECD, I mean, they all strike the chord that it's the wrong approach if you want to put in place a policy of innovation, whether it's in the field of the energy sector, to have a policy that that stops at the borders, so to speak. I mean, the process of innovation cannot or nor should be confined to geographical destination. You need the top researchers, you need the top scientists, you need the top engineers from all over the world to work together in delivering the strongest solutions. And I mean, we needn't have to look any further than what the world has had to endure, and unfortunately still is enduring in the context of COVID, in the context of COVID-19, where actually these vaccines were delivered in a relatively speedy time, underpinned by strong international collaboration. So the benefits are there, but there's already very strong structures in place, I mentioned, between the EU and China, private sector has to play a key role in that. And I would actually encourage companies to look more into the engaging on the EU research, innovation and science programs. In fact, the Director General for Research and Science in the European Commission was Dutch, Robert Jan Smits, for many years. He actually played a key role in putting in place that EU-China Innovation Dialogue that started in 2012. He's president of Utrecht University now, and the Netherlands Enterprise Agency is the lead contact point in that field. So the opportunities are there under the Horizon Europe Research and Science Programme, which is worth 95 billion euro for companies in Europe to work more closely in the key sectors that can deliver sustainability for broader society. And in fact, the national contact point, the agency that advises on these matters in the Netherlands, is the Netherlands Enterprise Agency. So they're just a few points I'd like to make. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I think we should directly launch into the Q&A and give our audience the opportunity to ask a couple of additional questions. And again, I hope that you've all had a good chance to use this webinar as a window into these dynamics. We are going to keeping an eye on these developments and hopefully have also future follow-up projects. If you are interested in what the Leiden Asia Center does, you'll find us on our website, of course, or via our newsletter or our Twitter account. So do join us again in future events. And so it remains for me to very warmly thank our speakers for making this such an exciting conversation, and of course you as the audience for joining us today. And I hope to see you very soon at the next event. So take care, everyone.